This video is dedicated to George Orwell, who was born in 1903 and died in 1950, and is one of the most prominent writers of 20th century English literature. It will most probably be a collection of videos to avoid making the lecture too long and therefore resulting in a boring monologue. This first one will analyze the frame, the literary and historical frame in which George Orwell lived and worked to begin with. Before going into detail, I would like to add that the specific video, the videos are not meant to replace the notes, which still represent the primary source of your studies. They are only meant to provide a support, an extra support to help you organize your work and understand which are the main points that you should focus on in studying the notes, and therefore underlining the main issues that we will be addressing. Therefore, as far as the frame, the outer frame, therefore the literary scenario in which George Orwell lived and worked, we have to underline firstly that literature in the 20th century is also called modernism because it breaks almost completely with past tradition. As a matter of fact, we can see right from the start that the authors that belong to this time can be, to simplify, distinguished in three specific areas. They are all considered psychological novelists, but as we will see, they are grouped together in a way that they are meant to emphasize certain specific aspects and themes that they are concerned with. So as we have seen, Joseph Conrad and Edward Morgan Foster were mainly concerned in portraying the limitations and possibilities underlying the complexity of human relationships, the deep contrasts that are produced by the closeness and the clashing of different cultures. As far as James Joyce and Virginia Woolf are concerned, that they exemplify the literary technique that goes under the name of stream of consciousness. And the third group, in which George Orwell belongs, is considered the anti-utopian novelists group, because they are mainly concerned with the social and political problems of the 30s of the 20th century. What are these drastic changes that take place during the 20th century? Well, first of all, like we have said, there is a break with the past tradition. The psychoanalysis studies carried out by Sigmund Freud and other philosophical studies like those carried out by William James in the United States and Bergson, who is a French philosopher, give us an overall idea of the deep differences with the past. As far as the psychoanalysis studies conducted by Freud and Fromm as well are concerned, we can say that they both underline that the inner development of the individual is greatly affected by the individual subconsciousness and not just related to the social relationships and the family relationships. They all concur in what can also be considered as neurotic obsessions, so subconscious feelings and emotions which strongly affect the individual's development, which at times can turn into into neurotic obsessions. This is also described by the Swiss psychologist Jung as a collective subconsciousness, which would help to better understand the impact of religion, art, history, mythology, and symbolism on human mind and behavior, which is a further contribution to the workings of the human mind were also given by the, like I said, by the French philosopher Henri Bergson, who introduced the concept of duration of time. One of his most famous examples to explain this idea is the difference between the idea of mathematical time of science and the human perception of the same time. So, for instance, if 1 minute, according to mathematics and science, consists of 60 seconds, and each second equals the other, and the time of the mind, which is lived in a personal way, changes from one person to the other, from one such situation to the other. So if the time is necessary, the time necessary to boil some water is the scientific time, the time that the person waits for the water to boil is the time of the spiritual experience, and it is always different. So in other words, there are times when the duration, the scientific duration of time has a certain impact on the emotion of the individual. Perhaps if we are talking of a happy moment, which is a moment that we will cherish, and because it is a happy moment, we will have the perception that it ends too soon. Whereas if we are going through a suffering, the time of that suffering tends to be perceived as endless. And this underlines the fact that there is no objective approach to experiences, but everything is subjective, and this is something that is well explained by William James, who states that again, reality cannot be objectively given, but it is subjectively perceived through consciousness, which means that individuals experience an interior monologue which has very little to do with the realistic pretension that we convey when relating that emotional experience. Because when we report what we have experienced in our emotional moment, we are rationalizing, explaining it. We are giving it an organization. But this organization is totally absent when we are directly living the moment. And this subverts the traditional narrative techniques and devices that had been employed till then. As a matter of fact, the novels of the Victorian age, for example, are mainly concerned with the storytelling. Now, the storytelling is effective if it follows, for instance, a certain order. As we have seen in Jane Eyre, the author chooses to proceed in a chronological development of the plot. So it begins with the protagonist of the story being a child, and it ends when the protagonist of the story is an adult. And we have followed in a straight line, a timeline that it is easy for us to follow because it is well organized and gives us stability in the development of the story. On the contrary, we have seen how Emily Bronte experimented instead the narration, a new type of a narration, which was later labeled as the Chinese box's narration. And in the specific case of Wuthering Heights, we see that there is a narration within a narration. So the novel begins at the end, or almost at the end of the development of the denouement of the plot, in which we have a narrator that will tell his experience of the Earnshaw and of the Wuthering Heights characters in general, but then he hands over the narration to a witness of those direct facts, which is Nellie, the governess. And at the same time, Nellie relates her personal witnessing of the facts, but at the same time she also relates portions of narration that she has heard from other parties, or at the same time, or she also reports of dialogues that conversations that she took part in with some of the characters. This gives us an idea of a change in the narration in the narrative techniques. This development is brought a step further with, like I said, the philosophical and scientific influences of the 20th century that underline the fact that the world is not as simple as it might have appeared through the representations of the so-called realistic novels of the previous age, during which the main concern of the writers was to give a rational representation of the society of the time. In this case, instead, the main focus of authors is not so much the portraying of a situation, and therefore the rational narration of it, whereas instead they focus their artistic techniques into investigating the turmoil of the human soul, which is no longer appeased by stability of the time. The historical developments of the time, on the contrary, have shown the world that things are not as clear-cut and simple as so far they have appeared. There is no rational consequence, and the perception of time is one of the main changes of this period, because time is no longer again perceived as a linear timeline, but it is instead a flowing of past and present that affect each other. As a matter of fact, the idea of present is no longer acceptable, because time is a continuous flow. And as we will see in future lessons regarding Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, who experiment greatly stream of consciousness, there is a radical approach in the description of the characters' times, in which it is the psychological approach that takes over rather than the rational explanation of how things take place.